associate professor. Jared, got it. Jared does fascinating work on how the brain represents the body. I find this work extremely interesting because we all sort of are able, I think, to get our heads around visual illusions and the fact that visual perception is inference, and that visual illusions reveal that we don't have direct perception of the outside world, but rather that's constructed by our brain. But as Jared and many others have shown, the same thing holds for our perception of our own bodies, which I just find fascinating. And he's going to talk about some of that work. In addition to his contributions to research, Jared also does a lot of great service to the field. He's on the advisory board for the Spark Society. He's run a summer undergraduate workshop at the University of Delaware. And in addition, just got a grant from the NSF to run a post-bac bridge program at the University of Delaware, which is taking students and training them in data science to understand brain and behavior. So I'm going to hand it over to Jared, and I look forward to his talk today.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry, they've got Zoom on this as well, and every now and then stuff pops up. So if I seem distracted, that's why. So it's great to be back here at Penn. It's great to see these familiar faces that I've known for quite some time. And I'll just get right into the content. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about is this concept of embodiment. And so the body's sort of a material entity in the world, just like, this chair here or a table. However, we don't perceive our bodies the same way as we perceive objects. It's kind of some of the stuff that Joe was talking about before. And one of the things that makes this really unique is its special relationship to the self, right? I have this really strong sensation that this is my hand, right? I have, oh no, what did I do?
We can't see your slides.
You can't see, oh.
There's always got to be something.
What's the we? Oh, the online.
On Zoom, we can see you, but not your slides.
Oh, okay. I don't know why that is, but we could try.
I'd much rather see your slides.
Yeah, they'd probably rather see my slides. So what am I then supposed to, oh wait, so they see me. Oh, that's the way they, okay. I do not know. Okay, so just try sharing the slides again. What do they see?
Nope, still see you.
Still see me. Should I kill the Zoom on here? Or share? Oh, I share it on Zoom. Got it. Sorry. Yeah. My apologies. Zoom. Wait, it doesn't. This.
Make that bigger, and then
I see. Share screen. Okay, and then talk. I assume. Share. Okay. What do they see now?
Slides, we see you, and we see your slides down the side.
Okay. So you see the which screen? Oh, I see what it is. Hold on a second. One more thing. I will try this. Stop share. Okay, so I'll do it like this. And then what I have to do is now I have to go and Alt Tab over to Zoom. Sorry, this is quite complicated. Then I do share screen. And then I need to share the one that shows the talk, which is which one? Oh, it's this one. Okay. Now we do this. I hope the audience enjoys me narrating this for them. Did I pass? Am I going to get admitted to Penn now? Congratulations. Well, yeah. I actually did apply to Penn as a graduate student, and I didn't even get waitlisted. That's right. I'm not going to hold that against y'all. So, okay. Body, embodiment, this is me, okay? This is something that's actually, now the clicker's not working. One last part, let's try that. Ah, yes. All right, something that has a sort of clear sort of commercial interest right now, right? So you've got Zuckerberg and the metaverse and all these kinds of things, right? Where they're putting tons of sort of money and funding into trying to figure out how do we kind of do embodiment, right? How do we create a situation where we feel like we're in an immersive world with regard to this? And I'm not a VR person, I'm just a mere cognitive psychologist. Um, but what I like to do is in trying to think about this, I like trying to base it into the frameworks of a lot of the really great literature on multisensory integration. So there's a lot of cool sort of theories and whatnot that show how we take information from various senses and put it together to get a percept of the world around us. So you might have a bird up in a tree and you're trying to go and localize, is it this bird or that bird that the tweet came from? And there's all sorts of computational models that show how that happens. With body ownership, you've got these additional pieces that are really interesting and sort of make the problem more complicated, but more fascinating. So one is just the simple thing of body ownership. We have to take information from vision and touch and proprioception and motor control and put it all together. But when you solve that problem, it's not just, oh, that bird tweeted, it's, oh, that's me, right? I own this. This is my body, okay? The second is stored body knowledge. I show this picture of a baby because we have experience with our bodies since before we're born, okay? And so we have all the information about how my limbs can move, what my limbs look like, and all this stuff that also needs to be part of the process as well. And finally, there's touch. So with touch, one of the things that's interesting about it is that there's some illusions that I'm going to talk about which make it where you can embody something that's not yours. Okay, like the rubber hand illusion, for example. And one of the interesting questions is, if I feel like I own something that's not my body, can I also make it feel where I feel touch on something that's not my body? So these are some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to sort of focus on three major categories. One is body knowledge and multisensory integration. Second is localizing touch on the body. And third is body ownership and referred touch. And we'll start with this one first. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is evidence from body illusions, okay? And specifically the mirror box illusion. It's kind of the poor man's version of VR here. And so in this example, what you can see on the screen is that there's a left hand there that the subject places there. And then there's this mirror reflection such that it looks like the right hand is sort of right next to the mirror midline. But in actuality, in this example, the subject's hand is a good distance away from the mirror. And when you do this, it creates this mismatch, this sort of multisensory integration problem, because vision says that your right hand is close to the mirror, but proprioception says that your right hand is far away from the mirror. So basically, then the question is, where does the participant perceive where their right hand is located? And in a bunch of experiments that we've done and others have done with the mirror box illusion, it's either near or at the visually defined position. And I don't know how many of y'all have tried this illusion, but if you just have a simple mirror in your house or whatnot, it's really easy to try. And it's a really fascinating illusion because it's very powerful, it's very cognitively impenetrable. Like I try to think my way out of it, but I can't. I have this very strong sense that my hand or my body is where I see it. So now the question is this: what are the computations that are involved in embodying the visual estimate? Why do you feel like your hand is there? And so what we're going to do is kind of go to the multisensory integration literature with this concept called optimal integration. And basically the idea here is that since it's Zoom, I will use the pointer on here. I could do something technical. Basically, the idea is that you have information from vision and you have information from proprioception, and the spatial estimates are more precise from vision than proprioception. You can easily sort of tell that if you just kind of move your finger slightly, you can tell the difference, versus if you close your eyes and try to make a ballistic movement to your finger, oftentimes you're going to miss horribly. Your sense of proprioception spatially, oh, well, you were good at this, but a lot of people aren't. Your sense of spatial, your spatial acuity for proprioception is much worse. From a basically sort of a computational perspective, the most optimal way of integrating this information is by weighting it based on precision. So if vision is a more precise modality, you're more likely to sort of say, you're more likely to make an estimate that's sort of near the visual estimate than the proprioceptive estimate. Now you'll notice, and that's this SVP here, this is sort of the shared information there. Now you'll notice in this is that this visual proprioceptive estimate here is close to, but not exactly where the visual estimate is. However, oftentimes in the mirror box illusion, what happens is that you feel like your hand is strongly where you see it. And the reason why is that in many variants of the mirror box illusion, what you do is this thing called synchronous tapping, basically. So you basically move your hands synchronously. And what that does is it basically then adds additional evidence that says, hey, the visual information is what's important. And then you get this sort of binding that occurs, which I'm going to call full visual capture. And there's a nice old literature in the 70s of people doing stuff with prism adaptation where they really looked at this idea of visual capture. Now, let's get back to that sort of tapping part I was talking about. So full visual capture commonly occurs subsequent to doing movements that are synchronous in time and space, okay? So if you want the illusion to occur, or even more strongly, you move together. And if you want the illusion not to occur, you want to break the illusion, you have this asynchronous movement that you do. Sorry for the Zoom people, I moved my hands there. So when you're making a synchronous movement, okay, that movement is either congruent or incongruent in two different reference frames, okay? And I'm going to really oversimplify the reference frame part here for the purpose of the presentation. But one is spatial, okay? So I'll narrate for the Zoom audience if they can't see me. You can imagine if you take your two fingers and sort of just move them up, down, obviously that's sort of up, down, and I guess gravitational frame of reference or something like that. But there's also the motor aspect as well, right? You're making flexion, extension, flexion, extension. And so now, if you just go and take your hands and take one hand and turn it over and take the other hand, make one hand palm up and the other hand palm down, and you do that same movement, those movements are spatially incongruent, right? So on one hand, my hand's palm up, the other's palm down, but motorically, I'm making the exact same movement, right? I'm sending out the same motor command and whatnot. And if I were to think about this, abstracting from the spatial frame of reference and just think of a hand-centered frame of reference, for example, it's the same movement. So our first question was just simply, can motor congruence alone drive multisensory integration? So if you think about this as I've got different spatial representations, right? One that's spatial and one that I'm going to call motor, can just that information from the motor congruence, the fact that these movements are the same, be enough to create an illusion? And so what we did is we made a new illusion. So what we did is we put people's hands in the mirror box, and just to explain right here, so this is just for show. This hand is actually sort of in the very close to the mirror as well. So the only way that they differ is in sort of the angle of the two hands. So the right hand is, the right hand is palm down. So you see the mirror reflection such that the left hand looks like it's palm down, but the left hand is the mirror. Okay, so you do this for a while, and then basically what happens is this sort of neat illusion where people will strongly feel like their hand flips position. Okay, so they start off with the sensation that they're moving their fingers upwards, their palm is up, and then there's this state shift. Well, I'll talk about more about the state shift part in a second, where they then, boom, suddenly feel like their hand is palm down. And we monitor whether we actually have a little apparatus where we kind of make sure that their hand doesn't rotate. We monitor that their left hand actually doesn't change position. And experimentally, the way we look at this is essentially after we have them do it for 30 seconds, then we have them report on this sort of little circular analog scale where they feel like their hand is. And so like one of the experiments we did design where we had them do synchronous movement in time or asynchronous movement in time. And then we either have the mirror shown or occluded. And what you can see here is that when they have mirror view and they have synchronous movement, let me kind of explain the dependent variable. It's amount of illusory rotation. So because it's a 180-degree rotation, right, a full illusion would be something like this. Quite a few subjects actually report a full illusion. Some don't report it at all. Some report something in the middle. But overall, what you get is this fairly strong illusion that occurs. It's about, on average, half a rotation there. But I'd say about 40% of the subjects in this experiment showed a full illusion. Asynchronous movement, you don't get nearly as much. And then if you take away the visual information, so if you just cover that mirror up, in this occluded condition, you get virtually no illusion whatsoever, which obviously you would expect because you don't see that information. Okay, so first, can motor congruence alone drive multisensory integration? Yes, even if you have competing spatial incongruence. And then second, one of the things I want to point out here is that this congruence is based on sort of online representations of body position. So what I mean by that, right, is what you're essentially doing is you're doing a multisensory comparison of these state estimates at that moment, right? Vision's telling me that my hand is palm down. Proprioception is telling me that my palm is palm up. How am I going to put that together, okay? But that's just based on that knowledge of that state alone. What we're wanting to look at next is whether stored information about the body can also influence multisensory integration. So does your knowledge of your body that you've had for your entire life also influence this? And I want to note that most models of multisensory integration don't really take this into account, or they take into account a little, but it's mostly focused on the state estimate part. And to get into this in a little more detail, I'll talk about biomechanical constraints, and I will start with the demonstration if you want to do the demonstration, but obviously you don't have to. If you would like to, put your pizza down. And what I'd like you to do is place your hands on your lap's palm up and just watch the table, because I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and sometimes people hit their hands on the table. And don't look at your hands, okay? And what's going to happen is a left or right hand is going to appear on the screen. And what I'd like you to do is raise the matching hand as quickly and accurately as possible. So if you see your right hand on the screen, raise your right hand. And if you see a left hand on the screen, raise your left hand. Okay? Your admission to pen is based on this now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, this is a Friday afternoon group, it looks like. All right, because that's the easy one. That's the easy one. Okay. Yes, that's the easy one. All right, ready for the next one? Okay, we have some errors, and people might have been a little slower at that as well. I didn't see errors on the last one. Okay, and then one more. All right. Performance was poor on that one. Again, now obviously this is not like an actual experiment that we're doing right now, but just from watching the audience, and then for the Zoom group, I'm sure everyone online at home probably did perfectly, but not here. So this is a laterality judgment task. This is a kind of mental rotation task. And Branch has done actually quite a bit of work on this with regards to this and pain and whatnot. And so the idea here, right, is that this hand, by the way, and the answer was right for all three. Sorry, I thought some of y'all would expect a left at the end, so I went with another right. Meta knowledge, yeah. Okay, so here, this is a right hand, okay? And when your hand's at that position, or that's also a common default position of the hand, there's no real rotation that you have to do if you're comparing it to the position of your own hand. This one is a 120-degree rotation from the position of the first one. And I'm going to call this a less biomechanically constrained rotation. And the reason why is because if you take your right hand and try and move it into that position, you can do it, right? Now try the other one. I don't think maybe there's people that could do it. I cannot do that. So we're going to call this the more biomechanically constrained one. So the question that Parson asked with regards to this mental rotation task is it the case that you would this would influence performance? And now remember, this task doesn't involve any actual movement that the subject is doing, okay? And what you find is that's the case. So here is the performance on these are sort of the same rotation in degrees, less constrained, they are relatively fast, more constrained, they're quite a bit slower, okay? And so what they did is they argued from this, that this task uses a stored body representation that encodes the biomechanical constraints of the body to be able to do this task. And so we were curious about it, and we were like, well, this illusion might involve some of that as well, the illusion that we talked about previously. So do stored representations influence multisensory integration as well? So basically, I don't know how well you can see this, we did the same experiment as before, but in a number of different orientations. So in thinking about this, you're, again, vision sort of the modality that's sort of going to win out. And so imagine basically that the hand on the left, right, where the hand actually is, you're rotating it to match the position of the visual estimate, okay? If you take your right, or no, sorry, wrong hand. It's bad to be bad at laterality when you talk about this stuff. When you take your left hand and rotate it to the position that you see there visually in that 180-degree clockwise one, if you try it yourself, notice how it's like relatively easy, versus if you do the exact same thing in sort of the opposite direction, right, in that 180-degree counterclockwise, right, you start to feel a little bit of tension right here, correct? Or some people, maybe I'm just not the flexible one, but we also have experimental evidence that supports this as well. So what we had is sort of two predictions here. First, just the more angular displacement we would see, there would be less illusory rotation, which kinds of makes sense. The closer things are in space, the more likely they're to bind for estimates than when they're farther away in space. But the second sort of more interesting one was this idea of the more biomechanical constraint there would be, the less illusory rotation there would be. So it'd be comparisons of, say, this 180-degree counterclockwise one, where if you go from proprioception to vision, right, you get that little bit of, strain versus the other one where it's easier. Okay. And basically we found both. We found a main effect of angular displacement, but more importantly, we found a main effect of biomechanical constraints as well, such that for the less constrained one, we saw more rotation in this illusion, this rotation illusion, than in the other condition. Now, you might go and be like, well, that's a p of 0.035. I'm not so sure about this, blah, blah, blah. I did the same thing when I saw this data. But what I thought was interesting is that there's one more comparison that I didn't show you. And again, it kind of helps to try this yourself. These two conditions right here are what I'm going to call this 270-degree less constrained condition on top. So the hand on the left is the hand that's behind the mirror. That's the proprioceptive estimate. And the hand on the right is the one that you see and that it gets reflected over. Imagine this is like just a standard mental rotation task, kind of like a Shepard and Meltzler 3D Tetris Please kind of one. If I just wanted to rotate that left hand, the hand on the top left, to match the position of the hand on the top right, I could just turn it 90 degrees, right? But since it's connected to my body, if I'm using my own body representation to do it, I can't. Like that's a movement, or can people do? No, it's hard for y'all. Okay, good. That's a movement that's it's almost impossible to do, okay? Versus here, right, you've got a condition in which essentially it's the same rotation, but there's no constraints. You can just go 90, right? So if the brain is calculating this without using biomechanical constraints, we should see the same amount of illusion in both conditions. If it's using biomechanical constraints, we should see a lot more illusion in that bottom condition compared to the top condition. And that's what we see. We see about 70% rotation in the condition on the bottom, and we virtually see no illusion whatsoever for the condition on the top. Okay, so do stored body representations influence multisensory integration? Yes. We found more illusory rotation for the less biomechanically constrained rotations. And this is kind of interesting, especially for people interested in multisensory integration, because it's showing that it's not just unimodal noise that's used to solve this problem, right? It's not just these state estimates, but this stored information about the body is being utilized as well. So now that kind of gives this question of, well, how? What's the mechanism of this? So we're going to do is we're going to use a Bayesian causal inference framework as a basis for this, but note that there are probably other ways that you can explain this as well. So in multisensory integration, there needs to be some sort of inference when you have information from different senses about whether they're coming from the same source or not. It's called causal inference, right? So for example, in this illusion, if vision says that my hand is in one position versus proprioception says it's in the other position, the brain has to calculate, okay, is it the case that these are actually coming from the same source, or am I being fooled enough to where they're completely different sources here? Okay, so that's causal inference. In causal inference, there are sort of two pieces of information that contribute to figuring this out. One is what's called the likelihood. And here, basically, the way that's calculated is you essentially are just taking the state estimates from vision and proprioception, right? So if the visual estimate and proprioceptive estimates are close enough, right, you're going to be more likely to say that this information comes from a common cause. So you could imagine if I had a mirror box, right, where the visual information, the proprioceptive information were basically right on top of each other, you'd have a high likelihood of that. Versus if they're really far apart, obviously you wouldn't. But the second piece is the prior, which is the estimate of a common cause given past experience, right? So given your experience with the body, and also given your experience with this illusion, what is the likelihood that these two things should be bound or not? So what we think is going on is that this illusion is sort of involving both pieces. So first, this motorically congruent movement that we're seeing here, we think of this as sort of accumulation of evidence, which is also a part of these Bayesian models as well, because there's this recursive process where as you get more evidence to say that these two things are together, you basically sort of raise the prior. So when you kind of do these movements synchronously over and over again, even in a motoric frame of reference, that's sort of basically increasing the prior such that you think that they're from a common cause. Now there's the biomechanical constraints part. We think it's unlikely that this process just uses state estimates and unimodal noise to solve this problem of multisensory integration. Otherwise, you're not going to have these sort of really, really big, or these really, really big effects that have to do with the actual rotation of the hand. So our current hypothesis is that this might involve some sort of unconscious motor simulation to make the decision that these two things are the same. So it's not just about, oh, there's noise and vision and noise and proprioception, but to put it together, there might be actually some sort of unconscious simulation at work that then is doing the calculations to basically make the decision that says, yeah, that is my body. Yeah, I'm going to bind the information there. Okay. Yeah. Oh, and people are more than welcome to ask questions during the talk. Yes.
Yeah. Is it required that your hand has while it's in that position? I can like put my hand at that angle and put it down on the side, right?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. So the idea basically is sort of, because in this experiment, you see how you can also see the arm like this as well. So sort of putting all that into that. Yes. So I think we've never tried it that way, but I would assume that the vision part is really important with regards to that. Okay. And people are more than welcome to interrupt with questions at any time. More than happy to answer. So the future work that we're doing this illusion is on the phenomenology of it and the time course, because one of the interesting things about it is that the phenomenology seems to differ for different individuals. Started messing with this illusion, and this illusion came out from me and Tim Vickery, who's another faculty member of the university, with this before he had to teach sensation and perception. We're like, let's try stuff, and we're like, whoa, illusion, and then we had to come up with theory and stuff and whatnot, the hard part. But anyways, when I did this first, and every single time afterwards that I've done it, I experience it as a state change. Okay, so in other words, I start off using the example on the screen. I start off feeling like my hand is palm up, and then it's immediately at some point in time, I feel like my hand is palm down. No medium sense in the middle whatsoever. But as you can tell from that data, some people obviously experience that. And so we wanted to look at that further. And then we also did some outreach work at middle schools. And basically the kids there were like, it's rotating, it's slowly moving. And I was like, what? No, you're making that up. But we then did experiments on this and using a different variant of the illusion, not one with the rotation, but one based on sort of the azimuthal plane. We asked people every 5 seconds to report where their hand was. And we did it in a variety of different ways. We've got 4 experiments that have done this. Some people experience this illusion as a state change. It's my hand is where I feel it, boom, now my hand's where I see it. Other people experience it as this gradual shift. So we think there might be something to do with individual differences with regards to calculating that prior of causal inference there in having it happen this way, but we need to collect more data on this to sort of figure out if this is the case or not. Oh, sorry, I forgot that. Next, localizing touch on the body. And to talk about this, I'm going to start with probably what's one of the most famous embodiment illusions, which is the rubber hand illusion. And so for most people here are probably familiar with this illusion, but if not, the idea here is that we see in this individual here that their left hand is hidden. They can't see their left hand, but what they see is a rubber hand with a rubber forearm. And what happens is they're stroked at the same time synchronously. And when that happens, people feel embodiment. As you can tell by his reaction, though y'all reacted very strongly as well, which either means that you were embodying it or you just weren't expecting stabbing to occur. Just to let you know, experimentally, so what they do in this experiment is it's galvanic skin response when they do it as an experiment, and they actually compare how big the galvanic skin response is for synchronous stroking versus asynchronous stroking, and they actually find a difference. So it's not just the stabbing, it's stabbing plus embodiment. I didn't think I'd be talking about stabbing a lot today. Okay, so that's the illusion. So the first paper done on this, which was Botvinnik and Cohen, had a questionnaire with regards to this, and most of the research that's followed up on the rubber hand illusion has really focused on the ownership piece. Okay, like I feel like I own that rubber hand. But one of the interesting things is if you look at the paper, there's a question there that says, it seems as if I were feeling the touch of the paintbrush in the location where I saw the rubber hand touched. And if you notice here in the results at the bottom, everyone strongly agreed with that statement. There's no variance whatsoever. Everybody felt like the touch of the stroke that was happening was happening on the rubber hand, which is really neat because typically in our lives, we feel touch on our bodies. Now you're feeling touch on something that's not your body. So what we wanted to do was dig into this further, and I'm going to kind of take a roundabout way of getting to it because I want to talk about a case study because I love doing single case cognitive neuropsychology. It's old school, but it gives you some great stuff. So this is a case study DS, and he typically would not be a clear candidate at all for a study of touch. So if you look at his brain scan, what you'll see is he's got damage to the superior anterior coronal radiata, it's subcortical. And if you map out the somatosensory pathway, so from the thalamus to S1 and all the fibers in between, 100% intact. No problems there whatsoever. If you do a basic tactile detection task, so here it's this basic sort of staircase procedure, right, to find the threshold for his sensory abilities, he is just fine on both hands. In fact, he is better than I am at this task. He's well within the range of normal controls, right? So brain scan says the somatosensory system seems to be good. Tactile detection seems to be good as well. Why are we talking about him? Well, his tactile localization is horrible. So what you have here is sort of a picture. Each one of these sort of little things in black is where he was stimulated, and what you see in red or in the next slide blue is where he would make localization judgments. And what you see in gray is that's the contralesional side of his hand. That's the ipsilesional side of his hand. On his ipsilesional hand, his good hand, he's totally fine at tactile localization. Contralesional hand, he makes these errors where he puts his responses onto the contralesional side of his hand. You can do this in a number of different positions, palm up, palm down. This is with his hand turned 90 degrees. He consistently goes and says, wherever you feel touch him on his hand, he localizes it to sort of the left side of his hand in a hand-centered frame of reference, okay? So we did a bunch of stuff with this and we're like, this is really weird. We don't know why this is going on. We're hoping to have some sort of hint as to what the mechanism is. And the only hint that we had was this landmark localization task. So this was in a paper by Longo and Haggard and PNAS in 2010. And what they did here was essentially, and what we did with DS, was you put your hand on a platform like so, and then it gets covered up. And then what the experimenter does is they say the name of a landmark on the person's hand. So for example, they'll say ring fingertip or index finger knuckle. And then the subject needs to then make a pointing movement to judge where that landmark is on their hand, okay? And importantly, when you do this task, the subject's not using vision and they're not using touch, okay? So it's not like we're touching the person on the hand. They just have to make a judgment as to where that landmark is without visual information. So here is DS's performance. What you see here, the solid lines are the actual position of those landmarks on his hand. And then the dotted line is the mean localization judgments, because we did this, I forgot, like 10 or 20 times per location. This ipsilesional hand performance is really good. Basically, that's the way that you and I would look if we did the same task. Contralesional hand performance is interesting because he still maintains the shape of the hand really, really well. But you notice we've got this shift that's sort of down into the left relative to where his hand is, which surprisingly is kind of like the shift that's down into the left with regards to touch. So maybe what's going on is that the bias in his estimates of position sense is pulling his localization judgments down into the left. But we thought this was really surprising in part because it goes against a model that I wrote in a paper about 10 years ago. So I'll talk about that for a little bit. So what we did, and this is a paper that I wrote with Branch, but whatever mistakes are in the model are my fault, the good parts are him. So exactly, very good. I've been trained well. So the idea basically is that when you need to localize touch, it goes through multiple stages. Okay, so you take this information from these distorted maps, and then the first step is that you map it onto a representation of the skin surface. And importantly, this representation is what we're going to call somatotopic. So you're mapping it to a location on the skin surface, and then it doesn't matter anything about external space, right? So let's say I have a touch on the index finger, it's got the index finger coordinates, whatever that may be. I can move my hand behind my back here, whatever. It's always going to be exactly the same in that representation with that somatotopic frame of reference. And then the next step is mapping it to an external frame of reference, right? An egocentric frame of reference. So let's say I want to go and make a reach to where that touch is, or a mosquito lands on my finger and I want to swat it away. I then need to know where it is relative to my head, my trunk, my other arms, etc. And then that's when external space comes into play. Now, our idea here originally, or my idea, not Branch's, my idea, was that this was sort of an encapsulated process. So in other words, when you go up to the sort of mapping it on your skin surface first, it's just that. And then when you map it to external space, right, that's then the next stage, and that there's no sort of interaction between these representations. And it kind of makes sense, because why would you sort of want a system where if you touch me on my index finger and my hand's over here, I feel it on my index finger, but now if I move my hand over to the other side of my body, it shifts, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense for it not to be encapsulated. So we wanted to dig into this more with DS, but unfortunately he passed away. So we weren't able to test him on this further, but we thought, is it possible for us to kind of come up with a way to look at this experimentally, perhaps in neurologically intact individuals? So now we're going to bring back the mirror box illusion, okay? So what we've got here in the mirror box illusion is sort of two sources of information on where the hand is, one from proprioception and one from vision, okay? Now, let's say you have full visual capture, right? So the illusion works really, really, really well, and I feel like my hand is where I see it. Now, I'm gonna go and touch your hand, okay? And it's behind the mirror, you can't see where the touch happens. An interesting thing occurs. When you feel that touch, you don't feel that touch at all where your hand actually is. You feel that touch on the hand that you see, and it's accurate, right? So if I touch your middle finger on the hand behind the mirror, you're just like, yeah, I feel it on the middle finger of the hand that I see in the mirror. Okay, so again, we're creating this dissociation between where touch actually happens versus where you have this qualia of touch occurring. Okay, so what we think is happening, right, is that you go and you have this sort of sense of embodiment that changes. You fully embody that visual hand. Now, when the touch, and then, oh, sorry. What I'm going to say now is that your sense of touch is sort of anchored to that estimate. Okay, so this embodied estimate, this estimate, you know, the sort of the output of that multisensory integration, touch is mapped onto there as well, and it's anchored there. So now the question is this: is it the case that if there is some sort of feedback from these external spatial representations that tell you about position sense, is it the case that maybe you're going to have a little bit of a shift, right? Is that proprioceptive information still going to be there and exert some influence on your sense of touch to sort of shift that tactile localization judgment? So basically what we did is an experiment to look at that. So we used the mirror box here, and what we did were different conditions. And so, for example, so P10, V10, that means that the proprioceptive estimate is 10 inches from the mirror, visual estimate is 10 inches from the mirror. So this would be our control condition because the proprioceptive and visual estimates are exactly the same. Here in this condition, the subject's hand is actually close to the mirror, but visually, because it's a reflection of this right hand, it looks like it's far from the mirror. So if this proprioceptive information is exerting some influence on tactile localization, what we should see is a shift towards that proprioceptive estimate. Okay, so again, that's the proprioceptive estimate, that's the visual estimate. Then here you kind of got the opposite, right? Now, here, it looks like my hand is close, but in actuality, it's far away. Will I feel the touch on this hand, but there will be a little bit of a pull in the direction of the proprioceptive estimate of the hand position. So the way this experiment worked is we did 20 seconds of sort of synchronous tapping to make sure that the illusion had worked. If anybody didn't show the illusion, they weren't part of this experiment, but this illusion happens in a lot of people. Then what would happen is that before we started, we drew a grid on the back of the subject's hand that they did not see. They never saw this grid on their hand here. And when they looked at the mirror reflection of their hand, right, they would see this one that didn't have a grid on it. But we had a picture of a hand with a grid on it as well. That was sort of set up in kind of a battleship kind of, people have played the game Battleship, right? It was like D4, B6. So that's the way people would respond. We would touch them in one of these locations in red. They didn't see that it was red. And then they would make a verbal response and say C3, B7. And we then use that to understand how they localize touch. We did some shape analyses, some Procrustes analyses on their responses. The shape of their responses didn't change at all, but the location of their responses did. So here, this is basically the amount of bias that they showed. And this is the condition basically where P and V are together. Those are the ones where there's no illusion. There's a little bit of a lateral shift just in general for this condition. I'm not going to talk about that right now. But the important thing is this condition right here. If proprioception is farther away, is it going to then pull localization judgments in that direction? And it does. And then we have the opposite as well. And we find the same pattern. Now it should be in this direction, and it is. We then did 5 follow-up experiments taking care of various sorts of issues with regards to it, with regard to the interpretation. All of them strongly replicated this finding. So what we think is happening is that sort of my initial thoughts that these were sort of these encapsulated processes in going from a somatotopic map to an external map was wrong, and that there's likely some sort of feedback process that's occurring that sort of maps the touch back, and that external information exerts some influence on tactile localization. There's some debates I'm having with some group about exactly how this happens. We're not going to dive into it here, but that's essentially some sort of estimate must be happening there. Okay, last part, body ownership and referred touch. So in the mirror locks, that sounds tasty. In the mirror box illusion, we wanted to look at the effects of proprioceptive information on touch, and we took great care to make sure that in that illusion that I just showed you, that we were looking at sort of the mapping of touch onto their hand, right? And there they had full visual capture, right? So they really felt like the hand was sort of in that location, and then they mapped touch onto that location as well. So this kind of had us thinking about this idea of just the fact that it's really cool that you have this shift of touch, right? You're feeling touch in a location where touch actually isn't happening. And then had us thinking a little bit more about this idea of, well, if we can kind of tweak body ownership, maybe create these sort of edge cases where the brain's going to be a little confused about whether to own or not, can we kind of maybe dissociate the sense of embodiment, the sense of body ownership from the sense of touch? And to talk about this, what I'm going to do is discuss this sort of neurocognitive model of body ownership. And this is kind of probably the most influential model of embodiment and body ownership. It's been cited about 1,000 times. And in this paper, the idea is that you have these different comparators that need to be sort of satisfied for body ownership to happen. So this first comparator is this visual form one. So the idea is that, and by the way, backing up a little bit, a lot of this comes from the rubber hand literature. Okay, so a lot of this is based on, let's say I have a rubber hand, right? Am I going to embody it? Yes, versus let's say I stroke a brick a bunch of times and I have my hand behind it. Am I going to embody that brick? Odds are that you're not. Okay, so the idea here is that basically visual form is really important for embodiment based on this rubber hand illusion literature. The second part is posture. So if the viewed object is not in a posture that's consistent with your own body, then there's not going to be any ownership as well. Okay, and then I'm going to skip the third part of the model because we didn't test that. But then this third part of the last part is this part that has to do with touch. It's this idea that tactile referral precedes body ownership. So the idea, and again, this is based a lot on the rubber hand illusion literature. If I stroke the rubber hands repeatedly, the idea is I start to feel touch on the rubber hand. And then after I start to feel touch on the rubber hand, that's when I then start to feel ownership of that rubber hand. So it's sort of this serial process that occurs where the tactile referral has to happen first. And like I said before, the primary evidence for this is the rubber hand illusion literature. But there are some issues with the rubber hand. I love the rubber hand illusion, but there are some issues with it which might limit embodiment, okay? So first, I don't know, have any of y'all done the rubber hand illusion? A few, yeah. So one is it lacks realism. Like if you look at a rubber hand, you can definitely tell the rubber hand is not your hand, right? So that's one piece of it. And then another part is sort of the agency part. So in that mirror box illusion I was talking about before, the hand that you see in the mirror, if you're moving your own hand at the same time, you have agency over that, which is a really big piece of embodiment. And in most paradigms of the rubber hand illusion, you don't have agency, okay? So here what we wanted to do was see, can we use the mirror box illusion and kind of create these edge cases, these cases where, according to the Securus model, you really shouldn't have embodiment. So what we did is we kind of made variants of the mirror box illusion, one where the subject didn't have a visible forearm, and a second where the hand was in an impossible posture. And then the second question that we wanted to ask was, what is the relationship between referred touch and embodiment? In other words, If I feel like I have strong body ownership over the hand that I see, is it going to be the case that I always feel touch in that location? Or is there a way that we can kind of separate these processes out? Can we make it where somebody feels strong ownership over a hand, but they actually feel the touch in a separate position? Okay. So quickly, because I have no idea where I'm with time, what we did was a version of the mirror box illusion where they would tap together, their hands were 6 inches away. And there were two main conditions in this first version. One, which I'm just going to call the large mirror or connected hand condition. And in this one, the important thing to note is that the individual has view of their entire hand and forearm, okay, in the mirror. So they see that it's connected. The second condition is what I'm going to call the small mirror condition or the disembodied hand condition. So here, they just see their hand, and then there's empty space where their forearm should be. And the reason why I did this was because if you go and look at the rubber hand illusion literature, what you'll see is that when you do the rubber hand illusion, the way you're supposed to do it is you either have sort of a sheet where the rubber hand ends, or you sort of create like a rubber forearm. And the reason why is because if you have that empty space, the illusion doesn't work as well, or it doesn't work at all, because you have this violation of body form that's occurring, okay? So what we're doing here is we're also creating a violation of body form as well. When you have a hand throughout your entire life, you typically have a forearm that's attached to it. Okay. So the design, 3x2 design, synchronous tapping, we expect the most illusion in general. No movement, we expect some illusion. Asynchronous, we might expect a bit, but that's going to be the condition where we have the least. And then we have the large mirror and the small mirror conditions here. Okay. Oh, and trial design, basically, they would tap for 30 seconds. Then we would present a stimulus to the hand. They don't see the stimulus that's behind the mirror. It's completely covered. They don't see that happening. Then they're asked, where did you feel the hand is and where did you feel the touch was? And we have a lot of different variants of their response type. In this data that I'm going to show you, they had to make a categorical response. So they either said, it's in the hidden position, it's in the, where it actually is, it's where they see it in both, which is a possible outcome, or they don't feel anything, or they don't embody anything, which didn't happen in this case, but those are the possible responses that they could make. So first of all, this is their body ownership in the hand condition, for the large mirror condition with the 3 movement conditions, okay? So basically, these are the responses where they would say that they felt it at the visual location. So this is where the illusion is working. And as you can see here, this is sort of the obvious result. If you have synchronous tapping, you have the most illusion. No tapping, you've got a little less. Asynchronous, you have the least. But the interesting thing is the comparison to the small mirror condition, to the disembodied hand condition. If we want to go and take the Securus model, the idea is that if there's a violation of body form, there should be no illusion whatsoever, but that's not what we find. What we instead find is that there is a good amount of illusion. In fact, 60% of the trials, people say that they feel their hand in the mirror condition. Now, it's not the case that this violation of body form has no effect on embodiment, has no effect of body ownership, because we have a strong effect here. But it's basically what's happening, right, is that violation of body form is exerting some effect, but it's not completely killing the illusion. So what we think is happening is that the strength of this visual information is kind of overriding this other information that says, yeah, you shouldn't embody this. So now here's the touch part. We've got a lot of results with regards to this, but I'm just going to talk about the conditional probabilities here. So what I mean by that is, let's say the subject says, yeah, I strongly feel like my hand is where I see it in the mirror, okay? Not where it actually is. The question is, where are they going to feel the tactile sensation? Are they going to feel it where they see it, or are we going to see a difference? And that's what we do. On 62% of the trials, they feel it where they see it, but on 37% of the trials, they say, I feel like my hand is here, but I feel the touch in a separate location. I feel the touch back where my hand actually is. This is with a categorical response. We've been doing a lot of work with different kinds of responses. Likert scale responses, continuous responses, replicates for all of this stuff. There seems to be this dissociation that occurs in some cases with regards to this. If you then say, the illusion hasn't worked, I feel like my hand is where I see it, 96% of the trials, the subject says that they feel the touch there as well. So what this suggests is that this sort of sense of body ownership is sort of necessary, but not sufficient to pull the sense of touch over. Okay. We also did something with postural mismatch. I'll go through this briefly. We basically did the mirror box illusion, but instead we had it to where the mirror reflection of the hand was actually kind of, as if somebody was sitting in front of me, as if it was their hand there. The prediction would be you should have no illusion that happens whatsoever. That's not what we find. On about 50% of the trials and 4 different variants of the illusion, people said, I feel like my hand is over there. But they didn't feel the touch over there nearly as often. That only happened on about 20% of the trials. So to summarize, you can get strong ownership of the mirror hand even when it's visually disconnected from the body and it's in an impossible posture. And second, we think that this referral of touch might be a more conservative process that requires greater evidence than the self-reported body ownership. So to summarize, does prior information about the body influence multisensory integration? Yeah. Stored information regarding biomechanical constraints of the body seems to influence multisensory integration, clearly shown by the illusion that we were doing with the hands like that. Second, how is touch localized on the body? Well, we think it's a mapping to somatotopic space, but that it could be shifted or pulled by these representations of position sense, perhaps from proprioception. And then finally, what is the relationship between body ownership and referred touch? Well, we think this shows that body ownership is potentially necessary, but not sufficient to refer touch to the embodied body part. And before I stop, I want to advertise this bridge program that we've got going on. So just 60 seconds on this. Underrepresented students face lots and lots of barriers into getting into graduate school, so I'm not going to go into the details of that here. And so what we wanted to do was sort of create a program for students that were sort of post-bac in trying to get into graduate school. And so what it is, and the other thing that we found was that training in statistics, programming, data science was sort of really important for that. So thanks to NSF, thank you NSF if you're listening. What we did is we created this new program, 3-course sequence in statistics and data science, 3-course sequence in cognitive psychology and or cognitive neuroscience. They have full funding and support for the entire program, and it is limited. You can only be in this program if you're underrepresented in some way, either an underrepresented minority, first-gen college student, or a low-income student. So if people on Zoom or in person are interested in this, or if they want to advertise it to people that they know, colleagues that they know that would have students that would fit for this, please let me know, because we would love to have students, and we're just starting this program up right now. I want to thank 2 people in particular, one Yuchi Liu, who was the graduate student who did a lot of this work, a lot of the embodiment work, including some really cool stuff that I had to cut from the talk because it was already too long, was done by Elizabeth Amron right there. And then that's the lab, and I want to thank you for your attention.
Are people always confident in their answers, or are some people unsure where to go?
Some people are unsure where they feel the touch. So the results that I showed you for a lot of this stuff is based on categorical responses. We have these responses that are sort of Likert scale responses as well. Essentially, do you strongly agree with this? What we see is that for some individuals, it's always strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree. There are individuals where they're kind of like, not sure, but I think so. If you separate their data out, you still kind of get the same patterns that you get from here. But yeah, there are a few, not a lot, but some people that are not sure in their responses.
Do you think those things by reference because they were constrained and affect how well you respond, that they can, like, temperature or something besides class, like,
Oh yeah. Yeah, there are tons of other factors at play. And in fact, a lot of the rubber hand illusion literature has looked at that. So for instance, with that, you can sort of modify what the rubber hand looks like, for example, and sort of semantic information. So let's say you take a hand and you make it look like a monkey's paw or something like that, right? Is it going to be the case that you're going to have the illusion work there? So there's work on the skin color of the rubber hand, for example. Like if it doesn't match your own skin color, will you embody it? Yes. Size of the rubber hand, for example. That seems to play a role, but only if it's smaller. If this rubber hand is smaller, the illusion doesn't work. If the rubber hand is larger, the rubber hand illusion still works. Somewhat larger, not hugely larger. So yeah, there's a lot of other roles, factors at play, and I only have looked at a few, which is or I've looked at more than what I showed in the talk, but there definitely is a lot. Yes. I don't. So there are so many rubber hand illusion papers. I don't want to say no one's done it because probably someone has, because there are literally probably hundreds of rubber hand illusion papers. Somebody's probably done a robot hand study and I just don't know it. But off the top of my head, I can't think of it.
No, like just based on some other ways, because obviously it serves some differences between participants. And I'm wondering wherever, some differences may be related to some, I don't know, even psychological disorders. So I'm just gonna give an example. I have a background in psychotherapy and I have a lot of experience in of psychotherapy, and we work a lot with the bodies. And my experience is that we may believe that we are similar, but we are not as humans. So there are a lot of people who are disconnected from the bodies. So for example, if you ask someone, okay, where do you feel sadness? People can say, like, I don't know, I have no idea, like, this is my body. Like, a lot of people have problems with being connected to their bodies, with feeling their emotions. Where are they in the bodies? Or there are also research from, like, I know it from my practice, but also now some latest research just discovered what's like, what therapists knew from the last 100 years, that people feel emotions in different places, right? For example, someone is angry, may feel this anger, someone is angry, may feel anger in the, hands and stuff. So I was wondering that maybe some of your differences may be explained just by the difference between people and how they, everyday life, they are disconnected from their bodies. I don't know what the word is like. Probably there are not surveys for these things. Sorry, maybe they are, but it's wondering.
Yeah, so I'll talk about so we've thought about that quite a bit, and it's one of the directions that we're taking the research in right now. I'll tell you about a failed project and then a maybe not failed project. So the failed project was, we thought that people that were really, really good with their sense of proprioception would be better at, or not better, but would show less, would be more resistant to the illusion, right? So they would have a much more precise proprioceptive estimate, perhaps, than us, and then maybe we'd be able to see that. So we actually recruited University of Delaware athletes in sports that involve lots of manual dexterity and fine position sense of their hand to see if they differed in the illusion. No difference whatsoever. But what we are finding is that some of these illusions, so we've been giving people who take this the schizotypal personality questionnaire, and there we are finding that some of these body illusions, they are more susceptible to if they have high schizotypy compared to low schizotypy. We're at the beginnings of this right now, so like our first data seems to have supported it, but we kind of want to like do it again on a completely separate sample to go and see if it replicates essentially. But there's that. And it's not just for this illusion, but we do some other stuff with tactile processing and certain kinds of mirror touch synesthesia and things like that. Seems to have a relationship there too. So yeah, there are potentially individual differences that are caused by that stuff. But the thing that's a little difficult about it is sort of like, well, which ones are they? That might be a direction that works, but we still have to see. Yes.
I was wondering, like, I would think that if you use like VR, you would be able to like have body form, but also have like these impossible biomechanical constraints.
Wait, say that again. Use the what?
Or I'm also that's something, but like the idea of like, because a lot of these like are using the physical like
Oh, VR. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. But like, and so you have like the task where you had like, like you limited body form by removing the forearm, and you did like the task where like it's kind of like very difficult biomechanical constraints. So I feel like with VR you could both have body form but also have these impossible body movements. Has that been done? Like that for the body form, but also have these impossible hands, or is that not a thing?
I do not know if that has been done. I would love to do stuff like that with VR. I just don't. I'm an old dog who does not know new VR tricks with regard. So I have to, like train up a graduate student in how to do VR and program that stuff just right. And I would be horrible at that because I don't know how to do any of that stuff. So what I've done is sort of like I said before, the poor man's version of VR is the mirror box, right? Because it gives you this really convincing sense of what this hand is, right? And we can do all sorts of stuff there. I think the next, like a good step forward would be using virtual reality and doing it. But there with VR, you kind of lose some of the stuff in the mirror box, like the realism, like you have photorealism of the hand that you see there. In VR, the technology is really good, but it's not perfect. So that's one thing I'll say. The other thing I'll say is that in the many iterations of this talk that I sort of came up with, one of the things that I was looking at is that there's actually quite a bit of interest in VR and referred touch. So there's like YouTube videos about these people that go into VR and they'll go and they'll have the experience and they'll just start feeling the touch that's happening and whatnot. In fact, I have a whole separate line of research on the effect of vision on touch, which the VR stuff links up to, which I didn't have time to get into in this talk. But I do think that VR is a really strong avenue for that. And it's one of the, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg should give me a bunch of money to help out with regards to this.
So Jared, you talked about embodiment as a way of integrating pieces of information into a coherent body representation. But the word has, as somewhat different intellectual history as well. And it refers to the position that a lot of our conceptual repertoire is grounded in the body and in representations delivered by our bodily experience. So I was wondering if there's a connection somewhere or if your research program connects with that kind of line of work.
So it's funny, in the other iteration of my talk, I almost thought about starting and saying, this is what I mean by embodiment, and I don't mean embodied cognition. And part of the reason is I don't think it links up, mainly because I'm skeptical about embodied cognition, because a lot of the experimental claims in the embodied cognition literature don't hold up to scrutiny. That's a completely different soapbox I can get onto there. So I don't think they're necessarily linked with regards to that. I mean, obviously, I think that our body perception is a really important part of us and whatnot, but the kind of claims that they make in the embodied cognition literature about the links from perceptual systems to these cognitive systems, I think are overstated. But I also think that the work that I do can maybe help out a little by being a little more tight about exactly what your prediction is going to be in an embodied cognition framework. But that's sort of a completely different talk. But that's my 2 cents on it.
I have a couple of questions that I may have asked you in the past, but I'm going to ask them again.
I won't remember. Not because they're your questions.
So you were saying you just perceive a blood shift all the time, while some other participants, if I'm not mistaken, they don't perceive a mix. What do you think are the causes? So why somebody is perceiving? Is it because it's a strategy, so the accumulation of the information occurring in a different way for participants, or what do you think is?
I'm not sure. So I'll talk about kind of the empirical part that we still need to do, and then I'll talk about my basic beginning ideas of this. The empirical part that I think we still need to do is kind of figure out how standard it is, right? So one thing, we have that data there, but we don't have sort of this sort of test-retest data where if I go and I take somebody 10 times, are they always going to be a gradual shifter versus an abrupt shifter? To kind of think, to get at your individual differences question from before, is it something about the individual itself? So we're actually hopefully starting that experiment in the next couple of weeks, or maybe doing something like that in our lab this semester. With regards to the theory part, my guess is when I was talking about the basal causal inference model before, right? You've got sort of the likelihood and the prior of a common cause. My guess is that the likelihood piece, okay, so the piece where you're taking these 2 estimates, if you model that out, there you get gradual. Okay, so if you only mess with the likelihood, right, you can probably get a gradual shift. If you're doing a lot of work on sort of the prior, right, so maybe I'm taking that information from the tapping and I'm really weighting that strongly, and that prior is being like, yeah, I really think that these are from a common cause. There, you can probably get with small changes in that prior, you can get big state changes where you might get that shift over to where you feel it happen that way. But I'm not sure about that yet because we don't have enough empirical data to model it well. That's one of the things I'd like to do, but we need a lot more data to sort of inform a really, really good model of that.
My next question, so you were saying posture does influence somatosensory representation somehow. So your data support that, right? So, but what about time? So are you saying that they co-occur, or still the somatosensory representation is first? It's just like, you know, the time is pretty fast, so the postural representation has an influence that is kind of.
So this goes to like a little debate that's going on in this literature, because I originally sort of took this sort of serial processing approach, this sort of serial encapsulated and processing approach. That's probably like why I'm not a big fan of some of the embodied cognition stuff, where it goes from stage to stage and that there's sort of a time for that stage as well. So I'm not going to talk about the tactile temporal order judgment literature, but there's a literature that suggests it's like that. However, there's another camp, and I'm starting to see, you know, maybe agree with them on this. That's sort of like this very strongly Bayesian camp that says, no, these things are computed at the same time, and it's just a matter of waiting. Okay, so I have information about somatotopic space, I have information about external space, and then when it comes to the actual output of quality of sensation, it's just a matter of how much am I going to weight those two things? So there's no different stages. It's just they're all happening in the same time, and then brain has to say what information is most important given this task at this moment. I don't know which side is right, and I haven't tried to design experiments to sort of separate them out, but hopefully that kind of gets at your general question there. Oh, sorry.
I was wondering about the last experiment about what the linking the second part of the talk and the third part of the talk. So in the last experiment, when you touch them, is their localization any different if they feel the touch and the hand is in the mirror versus if they feel the touch where the hand actually is?
That
is their precision of where the touch is on the hand.
We did not do that. That's something that we would like to do, right? So in the second part of the talk, right, we really wanted to have this like full visual capture. We wanted them to really feel like their hand was there, just try and kind of get at the idea about the proprioceptive pulling that I talked about before. Here in this, we were just kind of trying to break embodiment, right? And we were trying to just see, can we separate them at all? Okay, and it looks like we can, given the evidence from this and some other experiments that we've done. One of the next steps is exactly what you're saying, right? Is saying, okay, well, now that that's happened, is it the case that you're going to have this like much messier estimate on the somatotopic side of things, right? So I feel like my hand, you know, maybe I feel like I'm embodying the hand in the mirror, or I have ownership over the hand in the mirror. I feel the touch where my hand is, but I actually don't really truly feel my touch exactly where the hand is. I might feel it in some sort of middle space or something like that. Or if I tried to localize it to my skin surface, I'd maybe see a much greater pull or something like that. Those are cool questions that we sort of have in the pipeline, but we have not had a chance to address experimentally yet.
Does the mirror box illusion ever come back? Like once you've achieved visual capture, if you like close your eyes for a second, or if you stop tapping or something, like does it look back, or do you stay with the inference you formed?
So we haven't tested this yet. It's funny, my first year graduate student had this very question. She wants to do an experiment on this. And the thing I told her, I was like, maybe, but it might take a really long time for it to flip back because of the strength of it. So in the rubber hand illusion, yes, it will flip back after, I can't remember, my graduate student here, she'd tell me because she was the one who read the paper. I think it's like after like a couple of minutes. Because the binding is stronger in the mirror box illusion, my guess is it would flip back, but it would take a lot longer. Now, the question about why it flips back, or actually, I'm guessing it would flip back, but I don't even know if it would, because if you just stop moving, right, you're not really getting any information that's saying, no, that's wrong, right? Asynchronous movement, yeah, you're going to get that. But if you just stop, my guess is that it's possible that you're just going to sit there and be like, yeah, it feels like my hand's there for a long time. But we haven't tested that yet. And I think it would be kind of a cool question to link up to sort of the modeling of how we take in the information from these senses and from stored information and put it all together to make that thing. I'll say one more thing. One of the things we're also looking at right now is this concept of accumulation of evidence. So a lot of the early multisensory integration work, it's just sort of like you have wonderful work. You have like vision says it's here, audition says it's here, put it together and that's it. A lot of this work with embodiment, you're accumulating evidence that says, I should believe this state or the other, right? There now you're saying, I'm going to stop accumulating new evidence there. I'm going to stop moving. Do you have this sort of drift that happens? Or do you have the decay in the representation that holds that information that then makes it to where the illusion is going to flip back? We don't know, but we think it's sort of ripe for exploration. And then anybody on the, I didn't look at